So hi everyone. Excited to be here to talk about this project. It's very different than a lot of the stuff that I've done in the past. So my work is sort of at the intersection of relationship science and affective science. So a lot of the stuff that I do tends to look at close relationships, often romantic relationships, and really looking at the way that people talk about their problems and stressors with other people. So this is a bit of a foray into some different land for me, but yeah, cool project. So feel free to just jump in and ask questions whenever. I like to be interrupted. So we're all likely way too familiar with the fact that the US has seen a rise in political turmoil, with stress about social and political issues on the rise. And APA's annual Stress in America poll even showed that 77% of respondents stated that the future of our nation was a significant source of stress in their lives, with nearly 70% of people citing the 2024 US presidential election in particular as a major stressor. And so these data point to a queer reality for many US residents across the political spectrum, and that is that social and political issues in the 21st century really occupy an important place in our minds and meaningfully influence our daily lives. And there's been a growing interest in the past couple of decades in the ways in which politics influence our everyday lives, with a lot of the work coming out of not only this lab, but also the broader NYU social psych department. And so a lot of this work shows things like how political conversations over social media perpetuate negative affect and the spread of misinformation. A complementary body of work highlights the important role of political conversation, showing how cross-partisan conversation is associated with reduced polarization. And then some work outside of social psychology has examined political conversation sort of more generally, demonstrating a link between political talk and increased political action. Yet absent from a lot of this work is a deep examination of how people are talking about social and political issues, especially in their daily lives, and whether certain ways of talking about problems and regulating emotions is related to more or less political action during a politically relevant time period. And so in this work, I contend that conversations about social and political issues, even those that extensively focus on negative feelings and anxieties surrounding political stressors, play an important function in sustaining and even increasing political action. And so in particular, in this current work, and in a lot of work of mine, I focus on this concept of co-rumination about social and political issues as one kind of specific manifestation of negative problem-focused talk. And so co-rumination is likely a less familiar term than rumination for many people, but you can think of co-rumination as ruminative behavior that happens sort of like aloud in conversation with somebody else, whereby two people are frequently discussing problems, discussing the same problem over and over again, thinking and talking about the causes and the consequences of issues and really hashing into their negative feelings. And so co-rumination has been proposed to be this combination of self-disclosure and rumination. And so because of this self-disclosure component, it's been associated with sort of social benefits or interpersonal benefits, like feeling closer to your co-rumination partner. But because of this ruminative component, it's also been shown to be associated with negative affect and internalizing disorders. And so it's important to kind of note how co-rumination has been studied in past work. So since it was established within developmental psychology, a lot of this work has focused on how this unfolds in adolescent relationships. Moreover, this work tends to explore co-rumination as a sort of stable trait-like variable, either like you're a co-ruminator and you're not, rather than looking at these fluctuations over time, right? It's a strategy that people engage in sometimes. And last, perhaps because of the focus on adolescent samples, co-rumination research has ignored this specific way of talking as it relates to social and collective issues, instead focusing more on sort of personal, almost interpersonal stressors. And so as a direct consequence of this, more collective outcomes, things like political action, have been largely overlooked. And so with these gaps in the co-rumination literature in mind, then the current research focuses on exploring how these fluctuations in co-rumination about social and political issues are associated with changes in political action in adult samples. And so since there isn't really much research on co-rumination and political action in particular, we can turn to some of the research on rumination to inform our hypotheses. So some of the most cited research on rumination demonstrates a link between increased rumination and behavioral inhibition. For example, some work has shown that individuals higher in trait rumination were less committed to plans they made, and other work has exhibited an association between depressive rumination and increased justification for avoiding action. And so from this work, we might predict that because rumination is a core component of co-rumination, then perhaps co-rumination should be associated with less political action. However, when we turn to work that has actually explicitly examined rumination about social issues and intentions to engage in political action, not just action sort of in general, we see an opposing pattern, with research showing that rumination about discrimination is related to increased collective action intentions, that higher trait level rumination about why a person feels depressed is associated with increased political efficacy, and that ruminating about how sexual harassment affects a multitude of people and not just oneself is associated with more political action against gender inequality. And so this work then suggests that co-rumination about social and political issues might actually be related to more political action. And in fact, this is aligned with the goal progress theory of rumination by scholars like Martin and Tesser, who posit that rumination happens in response to unattained goals, especially those that are super focal to our well-being, and that rumination can at times then help people stay engaged and motivated to sort of take action on some goals. And taking a little bit of a broader picture, other research assessing the association between emotion regulation strategies beyond rumination highlight how distancing rather than engagement strategies, so strategies such as reappraisal, distancing, and suppression, are associated with less political action as well. And so taken together, kind of the goals of the current work are to collate work in about political conversation with that of self-emotion regulation to examine social emotion regulation or interpersonal emotion regulation. And in this work, we leveraged 2 repeated measure studies to test the competing hypothesis of whether within-person fluctuations in political co-rumination are associated with more or less political action directly surrounding the 2024 US presidential election. And in particular, drawing on this prior work on emotion regulation in response to these socio-political issues, we predicted that increases in co-rumination would be associated with more political action. And so as a first stab at testing this association between co-rumination and political action, we ran a 4-wave study. So it was the 3 months surrounding the election with 2 waves before the election and 2 waves after the election. And we had 306 participants with their demographic breakdown here. So we had about equal liberals and conservatives, as well as a good chunk of people who identified as moderates. And we have their voting behavior here as well. And participants were told to reflect on the prior 2 weeks and choose who they spoke to the most about social and political issues in those past 2 weeks. They then answered 5 co-rumination items regarding their own social rumination. So things like, I talked a lot about all the different bad things that might happen because of social and political issues. And the same 5 items regarding their partner's social rumination. So my partner did the same thing. And then participants were shown a list of 19 political behaviors and asked to rate the extent to which they had engaged in these behaviors in the past 2 weeks. And so the behaviors spanned from easier to endorse actions, so things like consuming or posting on about political issues on social media, to more difficult actions like volunteering. And so turning to our results from our multi-level model, we have visualized here the within-person association between co-rumination and political action. And we see here that there's a small but meaningful association such that it weighs when participants reported co-ruminating about politics more than was typical for them, right? So it's comparing it to their person-specific average across the whole study. They also reported engaging in more political action. Yes.
So I have a quick question.
Yeah.
Did you do like a factor analysis on the political action?
Good question. So we looked at reliability on the 20 items, both between and within person. So just Cronbach's alpha and within person change reliability. And we had high reliability on both of those things, but the way that we were kind of construing of those political behaviors was thinking about it more as like a formative measurement model. So thinking that the items are coming together to cause more political action rather than political action like causing the items. And so in that sort of case, you don't even necessarily have to like have such a high Cronbach's alpha, because the idea is that the behaviors sort of together create the latent construct itself. But in this study, we did have sort of like high reliability anyway. In the second one, we just did a checklist. And so in that case, you sort of for sure don't expect that those things are going to necessarily hang together, right? It's not like on a day when I do this, I'm going to do everything else. That would be kind of crazy. But yeah, good question. And just a note, I don't show p-values. All of this is a Bayesian approach, so we just sort of show the credibility intervals here. And we also didn't see any difference based on who people voted for. So it wasn't like the association was stronger for those who voted for Trump versus those who did not. And so in study 2, we wanted to replicate this work, but look at it in daily life. So whether daily increases in co-rumination were associated with more daily political action. We also wanted to explore a mechanism looking at whether this association between these two things could be explained by changes in motivation to stay engaged with issues, so sort of directly testing that whole progress theory of rumination hypothesis. And last, capitalizing on the intensive nature of these data, which I'll talk about in a second, looking at how heterogeneous these processes are, right? So how much variability there is between persons. And so to answer these questions, we ran a 28-day daily diary study tracking participants the 2 weeks leading up to the election through the 2 weeks after the election, with day 15 being election day. Hannah here was our fearless leader on this study, making sure all of our research assistants were doing their job. So all of this couldn't be done without Hannah, making schedules and all of those things that I surely didn't want to do. So we ended up having 197 participants in our final analysis. They were racially and ethnically diverse, about 38 years of age on average. This is a community sample, so we recruited from the community in New York mostly, which meant that they were predominantly Democratic and voted for Harris. And each evening, participants answered a number of questions, including a yes/no question as to whether they talked to anybody about social and political issues that day. And if they said yes, they were then given co-rumination items to fill out, similar to what was included in study 1, but adapted for daily usage. They were also given a version of study 1's political behavior items, but now it was just a checklist. So each day they checked off as many different political action behaviors as they did that given day. And then we had this single item question asking about how motivated participants were to stay engaged with social and political issues on that day. And so before I get into our modeling approach and our results, I want to show just sort of the raw data to get a sense of the trajectory of these things over the 28 days. So we see here that co-rumination is shown in blue. We see that it spikes on election day and comes to a head the day after the election, when our predominantly Democratic sample knew who won, right? So not super surprising. And then it declines in those 2 weeks following. And we see that actually—
Interesting, there's like no anticipatory co-rumination. I might have expected as it gets closer, you get like—
I know, like this is day 14, and it's like just the same thing, right?
That's interesting.
which is very interesting. There's a lot of heterogeneity, so if you look at like the person-specific plots of this, they're going all over the place, you know, so some people are doing that, but on average, yeah, it's really like that movement is happening in those days, which is pretty cool. But we see just from this that these things look like they're moving together on average. I won't go into the deep details of the statistical model, but we ran a multi-level model in M+. We did latent mean centering to disaggregate within and between person effects. But we have talk and co-rumination here modeled as time-varying predictors, where co-rumination is specified as 0 on days when participants didn't talk to anybody. We specified a spline model to properly assess this trajectory of political action leading up to the election day, the change on election day, and how that trajectory differs after the election day. I won't present that part of the results here, but I have them and I'm happy to talk through that. And then we specify political action as our DV, an estimated random. Whoa. And we estimated random slopes of all of these different time varying effects, which allowed us to look at this heterogeneity here. And so first we can look at the association between just talking about political issues and action. And so we see that on days when people talk about social and political issues, they also report engaging in more same-day political action. So this black dashed line here represents our fixed effect, or the effect for the typical person from this multi-level model. And then we see the heterogeneity or the variability in person-specific slopes shown through these individual bars and the spread around this black dashed line. And turning to our main hypothesis, we see that there's an added benefit of co-ruminating about social and political issues, such that on days when people are not only talking about these issues, but also co-ruminating more than is typical for them, they're also reporting these same day increases and engaging in more political behavior. And so interestingly, although we see a significant amount of variability in both of these effects, so a lot of spread around that fixed line, we see very few reversal effects. The reversals are coded in this or colored in the slightly different colors here. So I normally see more reversals in my work. So I was pretty surprised by this, especially because there's a semi-strong competing hypothesis about co-rumination and less action. But here we're really seeing that this is an overwhelmingly positive association, that people are doing these two things a lot.
How explicit were the goals of the study for the participants, and were there any like distractor questions in the diary?
The goals were not explicit at all, I would say. They were just told like, we want to hear your thoughts about the election. And so there were a whole ton of different measures. Yeah, so I mean, they see these same questions every day, but there was also stuff about, you know, mood and self-emotion regulation and how connected they felt to people that day, and yeah, a whole bunch of things like that. Yeah.
Sorry, can do you also have individual rumination data?
I do, and I didn't look at it.
Okay. I'm just wondering if the co-rumination is what drives action, but like individually just panicking or ruminating is not related or less related, or more maybe.
I would hypothesize that, like, aligned with sort of the work on co-rumination, we see that in general. I mean, there's again two sort of competing hypotheses here. I would say that there's some work that says that like rumination is bad, and then like we only get the benefits from co-rumination, and that's sort of what we see when you look at the typical associations between like rumination. You don't feel closer to anyone when you do that. That makes sense. But because co-rumination is a social thing, we see that benefit there. But then if we're looking at sort of the prior work about, you know, rumination and some of these social and political issues, some of that is pointing towards an association between co-rumination and political action. So we could predict from that maybe we would see the same sort of thing. I think none of that work is like daily diary work, so a lot of it is like correlational. I think there might be an experiment or two, but yeah, I think that co-rumination has sort of an added value in that, like, when you see somebody else cares and two people are sort of doing it together, that in and of itself, that sort of social factor is like an extra motivating sort of drive, but yeah.
I would analyze it, cause
I know,
I think that's a
really
really
should.
interesting, what you just said is my intuition too.
Yeah,
And that would be a really interesting just take home for humanity, right? That,
Yeah.
like, if you're talking, don't just sit there and like think about it yourself. Talk to somebody and work through it together, and that's what drives some kind of positive action in the world. That's
Yeah.
a really important, if that's true, that'd be a really important finding, I think.
yeah, and I mean, I guess like some of this, the talk effect in of itself sort of speaks to that, right? Like not fully, but like we do see that just talking to somebody is associated with more political action, so that probably gets at that a little bit, but yeah, I probably should. I have the paper like basically ready to submit, but
I'm telling you, like, that would be like a sentence in the abstract if you show that difference. I think that's a big finding.
yeah, you're right.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Do you think the political action kind of leads to like social reward in a way because you talked about it with someone, and that's why you're more likely to do some action because you feel a sense of social reward from it?
That the talking gives you social reward and then
No,
are you
the
saying?
action makes you like feel like a little bit of social reward because like you talk to someone, then you're doing the action, you're probably gonna talk about doing the actions with that someone, so you feel it's something. Oh, like I did something.
I see. Okay, so you're kind of talking about like a bi-directional sort of thing. Totally. And I think that's like great. So this is correlational work in that like I'm not getting at causality, I'm not getting at directionality here. I'm sure someone will, did you do lagged effects? I hate lagged effects, but I did look at some different lags. And like we kind of see evidence of like both directions happening. And I think that like probably that's the truth of it. Like exactly what you said is like talk, and you're like, all right, I gotta do something, I do something, and then you're like, okay, now I want to talk to somebody about it, right? So like you probably see that sort of loop happening, which I think would be cool to examine potentially in some like experimental work.
I also wonder whether, just to jump in because we talk, whether there's like an efficacy effect that like when you talk to someone, you feel like more efficacious, and that's why you're jumping more into it.
Totally, which I think it's not exactly the same thing, but this like motivation to stay engaged, I think is somewhat getting at what you said, Ani, not directly, but here I was thinking like, yeah, well, why would co-rumination be associated with this? And potentially because it is a thing that like, yeah, either makes you feel efficacious or is something that's sort of like mobilizing, motivating you, right? And so we did a multi-level mediation to look at this, and we find that, you know, on days when people report co-ruminating more than is typical for them, they also report feeling more motivated to stay engaged with these issues, and that then higher motivation is associated with increased political action. Again, we find heterogeneity in all of these different paths, and when we look directly at the mediating effect, we see that about 40% of the total effect is explained by these increases in motivation, so quite a bit of it. So yeah, I mean, that's really it for this, and so I think kind of the take home right across these two studies, we find that co-rumination about political issues is associated with increased rather than decreased political action. We have some evidence for a mechanistic explanation that some of this is explained by these increases to stay engaged with issues. And I think sort of like a broader point about this body of work, which is like also a slight call out to some of the stuff that I like haven't done really in some of my past work, but that I've been thinking a lot about recently, is just that like studying co-rumination about sort of specific topics and like in the actual context really affords us some insight into the function that might be occurring of this specific type of problem talk in specific contexts. And so some future directions, of course, we can talk about experimental manipulations of co-rumination, subsequent action, and perhaps the reverse sort of pathway, right? Comparison of co-rumination to other emotion regulation strategies. So something like co-reappraisal, when two people are talking together and they're like, oh, well, it's not that bad, right? Like, don't worry. And finally, a lot of my work is dyadic, not this work. So sort of fleshing out the dyadic nature of this a little bit more. I have some other work on co-rumination in sort of like more explicitly dyadic contexts. But also thinking about, I think, like action in a dyadic sort of way, right? Like, are people doing action alongside the person that they had this conversation with, or is it like they're just sort of irrelevant, but I go and I do it sort of individually? Yeah, and I think just a final sort of, not working, yeah. Kind of taking a step back and considering the broader picture here. In a time when politics, I think, feels more important than ever, but also sort of deeply alienating, right? When we're bombarded with information all the time and we're sort of like, what do we do with this? Our private conversations do take on sort of this public significance. And so whether it's at the kitchen table or in a group chat or a conversation that you have with a neighbor, these political issues are really permeating our everyday existence. And so if we want to understand how politics are affecting people's everyday lives, paying attention to these sort of ordinary spaces of conversation is important. And with that, this was a sort of collaborative effort. So thanks to all my colleagues here, including Hannah. I have a lot of data from this study, and I can't lead everything. So if people are like interested in what other types of questions are here, I'm happy to chat more.
Thanks. Do you have any social media data? Like, do you ever get them to talk? Because there's a big debate in the social media literature about hacktivism. Like, if you post something, does that like make you less likely to take political action because you feel like you've already scratched that itch or done your thing? And actually, there's an argument that like posting about political things on social media actually erodes collective action.
Yeah. So, and I mean, this could be debated for sure. Like, I have some of my political action items are social media items, right? And so someone could say, well, that's not political action, or that is political action. So I do have those items in there, and they're more heavily endorsed, which is not shocking, right? Than like I went out and I protested today. I did do some supplementary analyses, like looking at some of the like more active, harder to, and you find the findings shrink, which isn't shocking, but they're still significant. So yeah, I do have that. I think that's right. Sort of like a bigger question of like, what is political action?
Posting can be a form of political action.
Totally.
I disagree with it. Yeah.
And it's like better than nothing, I think, but also right, if you're like, now I don't have to do anything, then that's
You
probably
did
not
like
great.
the issue is like a lot of political action for real change is really hard. And like posting something is super easy.
Exactly.
And so it's like, but if you're gonna post and you're not, that means you're not gonna go to a protest,
Right.
you're not gonna write a letter to your senator or something.
Right.
That it might actually undercut the possibility of political change.
Right, totally, yeah. Yeah, and I think one of the kind of supplementary analyses that I had ran didn't have some of those more social media items, and again, to find it, but just smaller.
Yeah, the alternative theory is if you take political action, you'll do it on multiple channels.
Domains, exactly.
Posting and maybe posting gets you mobilized because then
Right.
people give you positive feedback and then you're more likely to go to, that's why it's like an interesting debate.
Totally.
Your data might be able to like look at that.
Yeah, for sure.
There's somebody on Zoom with a question.
Yeah, I have kind of like pet peeve in question. Thank you for the talk. I was wondering about the function of this co-rumination, and it seemed to me, especially in the conclusions, that most of the evidence goes towards it being a emotion regulation strategy. But I was also wondering whether or not it could be a way of like checking reality or making sure that things are as good or bad as they seem. Because to me, like if an alien ship would come, the first thing that I would do is not to run away, would be to call my wife and be like, "Are you seeing this?" So like to be sure that that something is happening before I do something. So yeah, I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I've thought a lot about like co-rumination and shared reality basically. And so like whether this is a mechanism to do, I think exactly what you sort of just said, right? Where you're like having a conversation to sort of like check the temperature on this sort of thing and see like, do you agree? Do you not agree? Like what's real, what's not real? And so I would predict that probably we would see an association between co-rumination, and I do actually have some shared reality items in this study. So I think that that could absolutely be one type of mechanism that is like, yeah, less focused on the emotion part and more focused on the sort of like epistemic part of it all.
I know your sample was mostly Democrat, which makes sense, it's New York. But I was interested in like whether you think there's any interesting interactions with party. Like I could expect a main effect, like people who are Republican are less likely to share their feelings with others and also probably less likely to be activists.
Yeah.
But is there anything about the nature of how they talk about these issues with each other that would influence the effect?
I did look at a moderation based on who people voted for. So like very underpowered to detect a difference there. And I did it as just like voted for Trump, basically like you won, you lost. And I didn't find anything there. And I was a little bit surprised. I thought that there was probably, I kind of thought maybe there would be a stronger association between the two for, you know, more left-leaning people. But in study one, we didn't find that, and we were actually like more powered to detect that. So yeah, so I mean, at least in these two studies, it seems like it's sort of happening across the board.
I also, had a similar question, where post-coffeation was a moderator of that relationship, but you could also ask, could it depend on things like which party is in power right now? So more of a historical context, because if your
That's interesting.
party is in power, maybe you feel like you don't have to take so much political action, even by ruminate, because you're like, oh, they got this, you know, they're gonna handle it. Whereas if you're, you know, the underdog, then you might feel like, oh, you know, our lives, our security, our values are at stake, and we really need to amp up the political action.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Like, and I think that sort of speaks to like, again, the function of it, right? And like who's co-ruminating and why. And yeah, I would expect, you know, when you're more unhappy, it's something that's likely to happen. A lot of the co-rumination work tends to like, most of it is not causal, so it's not a very good, but like most of it tends to be like co-rumination causes negative affect, and I think like the other direction is surely the case too, right? Like people aren't co-ruminating if you're not upset about anything. So yeah, I think totally.
And I was thinking, you know, maybe, you know, it's already taken into account because you're more likely to ruminate if your party's not in power, perhaps. But that might not be the case. Maybe you still ruminate even though your party's in power, because you're thinking about other things like the, you know, like this you know, the other party is evil and trying to destroy us, and you know, even though that's what we're hearing now, all the hate, right?
And even though I think like we're in such a day and age where like most people are just like sort of unhappy with politics in general, right? So like I think my sample had a lot of people who were like very left leaning, so they like were not excited to vote for Harris, right? So I think they were still very much engaging in this, and even if she won, I think people would have still been upset within the sample. So yeah, I think we're in a time point when there's anger towards both out, or like almost that people feel like they don't have an in group that's being sort of represented, right? Exactly. Yeah.
It's like the right hates the left and the left hates the left.
Totally,
It's a
completely.
real winning situation for the left.
And you should have seen like I had some like open-ended questions that I like just basically like, you want to tell me anything? Like the days surrounding the election, and like, oh my God, some of the stuff people were saying, and especially like, you know, coming from Columbia, and we ran this last year when Columbia's campus was especially crazy. And I
these are mostly Columbia undergrads.
Oh no, there's like basically no Columbia undergrads.
Okay, so
they're like all community members, but like I had one person who was like Trump won and it's your fault. It's students like you at Columbia. Like, I hope you're happy. It's your fault. I was like,
You deserve this.
I was like, whoa, I don't think it's my fault, but you're angry, I get it. Yeah,
Tough.
yeah, yeah.
One last question. Then we gotta cut it out.
Were there any dyads that had like different political affiliations?
So we didn't look at dyads here, they're just individuals. I had a question that asked people if they said they talked to somebody, it was just like, what's their political affiliation? More left than mine, about the same, more right than mine. And like 70% of people were talking to someone that they said was about the same as theirs, which I think, you know, speaks to the fact that we all live in our little bubbles, especially in New York. Yeah, Amy Gordon has a paper that came out recently where she looks specifically at like political affiliation within romantic relationships, and like she was like, basically everyone has the same political affiliation, right? Like it's like this value now that people are like literally filtering their dating apps on. So I think it's like kind of rare that we see that. But I think I was thinking before I came here, I was like, you know, thinking about all this stuff, and I was like, it would be interesting to see. I'm running a study, or getting ready to run what I'm calling the holiday conflict study, which is just looking at like conflict and tension and all different types of relationships during the like extended holiday season. And one thing that I was like thinking about is like how co-rumination might function in conflict conversations. I'm thinking about like the extent to which some of these like cross-partisan conversations might actually be characterized by co-rumination or not, and like how that might then manifest in like what people do after it, right? So yeah, interesting questions there.
Okay, thanks. Those were great talks.